Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Going to give everyone a minute to get settled and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get started. Hi, my name is Michelle Chula-Lipkin. I am the Executive Director of the National Association for Media Literacy Education. Thank you all for coming to Equity and Impact in Media Literacy Practice, Mapping the Field in the United States. This event is part of the 7th annual US Media Literacy Week, and we're incredibly excited to be here today to hear from the research team who have led these important efforts over the last year. I want to commend our principal investigators, Paul Mihailidis, Srivi, Ramasubramanian, and Melissa Tully for putting together an incredible team and for all their hard work. This project was part of NAMELY's International Research Initiative, which was launched in 2020 with a grant from Facebook, which included research in both the US and Australia. And last night, I had the opportunity to join an event hosted by the Australian Media Literacy Alliance, where the Australian research team shared their work and their recommendations on a national strategy for media literacy that came from the research they conducted. The work of these research teams, the work that they did over the course of the project is truly astounding, especially given the fact that it all took place during a global pandemic. Despite having to pivot time and time again, they move forward, committed to a collaborative spirit and dedicated to this important work. Before turning it over to the research team for their presentation, I want to take a quick moment to give a special shout out to Sherry Hope Culver, who served as project manager for the International Research Initiative. If Sherry will join me. There she is.
Thank you, Michelle. You pretty much summed up, I think, exactly how I've felt in watching these teams work and watching them pull together. The sort of the inspiration for how the research was conducted and how the research then, all the data was analyzed and the passion that everyone brought to the project. And I know that once people see this research, they're going to be as excited as you and I are to see how this work can really apply to moving media literacy forward. And I'm excited about tonight, and let's turn it back over to everyone because I'm excited to see what the project, how they present everything tonight.
Great. So let's hand it off to Paul now. I do want to remind everyone that's in attendance that we have the Q&A function open, and I'll be coming back to facilitate the Q&A portion after the presentation by the research team. Again, thank you to everyone who worked on this project. We're so appreciative to your commitment to moving media literacy forward. It's all you, Paul.
Thank you, Michelle and Sherry. Kind words that you offered earlier, they're much appreciated by our team, and we are really happy today is here. So on behalf of our entire research and design team, I want to thank everyone here today for being with us as we share what we hope is meaningful work that contributes to our community of practice and our community of scholarship. And also to acknowledge all the work that's gone into this. So starting with our collaborators, and namely our Australian research partners, all of the feedback we've received along the way from different stakeholder groups and educators that have helped test and give feedback, and scholars that have looked at this work. And a special shout out to our advisory group who's worked with us since we started this project. In capacity of really critical feedback, dialogue, and engagement with this work along the way. So we really, this is a wonderful collaborative initiative. And I want to start by acknowledging the collaborators that are part of our team. It's a handsome group of collaborators here across these 4 institutions. And my colleagues Srivi and Melissa, our co-PI team, along with Bobby Foster, our research manager, and Patrick Johnson and and Emily Ruisdahl, who have served as part of our research team as well. We say that these projects they're as valuable as the collaborative group is, and it's been such an honor and a pleasure to work with this team across the entire phase of this project, navigating the global pandemic that had to shift our research process and our research approach, and consistent effort, even as the last minute edits were happening in these days, to get the report up and to everybody. And of course, our project is not only the result of research. It's a research project, but as applied researchers, we were thinking about what we could offer for the academic community, but also for the practitioner community. So we had a design mindset going into this project. And so who you see here is our team of front-end and back-end designers that have helped us along the way with this project. And they have been invaluable in terms of the aesthetics that you see in the website and the report. So I want to also just thank this group, Sydney, Johnny, Sumi, Michaela, and Aaron, for all of your work and your help. So now that our acknowledgements are over, I wanted to just start with acknowledging the values that guide this project. So today and in this session, we're going to share with you the results of a research report on equity and impact, mapping equity and impact in media literacy, or mapping the field in the United States. And then we're going to share with you this field guide that we've created, Field Guide for Equitable Media Literacy Practice. And these findings are built on the shoulders of so many in our media literacy community. We acknowledge again and again the work that's been done in formal learning institutions and informal spaces of learning, in communities, in classrooms, with administrators and policymakers. And we use so much of that work. And we think that all of this research has been valuable to us. And our project was guided so much by this work. And we decided that in our project, we would put our values transparently and upfront in this process. So what you read here is, a little bit of the direction that we took leading this project. We believe that media literacies are central to a society that demands accountability from public institutions, equity for marginalized and underserved communities, and robust opportunities for people to use their voice to advocate for more inclusive futures. This guided our work, this belief, and instead of offering our own definitions, we took these values and others and used them to guide this project through all phases of research. And of design and creation. And as you'll see in our report, we're very upfront about locating our research, about our own standpoint in relation to this work, and about our own assumptions and those of the academic communities that we built from to make this work as inclusive and reflective of our media literacy community as possible. So with that, I think I would like to, as you say, we're going to start and we're going to have our whole research team be able to participate here. We're going to introduce the first phase of our project, which is our literature review, attacking core assumptions of media literacy education. Then we'll move to our research findings, and we'll conclude with the presentation of our field guide for equitable media literacies. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Srivi now, who's going to talk us through the first phase of our project. So Srivi, you can take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Paul. I have to reiterate the point that this has been such a fabulous collaboration, and I want to thank namely for this opportunity. For this, as we approached media literacy from the perspective of what is impactful, we wanted to think about media literacy as impactful in the context of prioritizing marginalized groups and underserved communities, and what is the role of media literacy in working towards justice and equitable futures, and how can we be guided with whether our practices are being guided by principles of care and community, risk-taking, and so on. So from this perspective, we started by interrogating some core assumptions about media literacy and whether that is impactful at multiple layers of multiple systems. So we approach this by thinking about what does impact mean and how can we think about impact on the individual communities and societies. So we thought it would be helpful to examine whether some of the taken for granted assumptions within media literacy field are some things that we can examine through our throughout our process, our project. And so we looked at 3 different assumptions that our project wanted to interrogate further. The first one being whether media literacy prioritizes individual agency. Now, if you take the word agency, it's we assume that it's a positive thing, and that when you have agency as an individual, then you have the ability to bring about impact on your own self, on others around you. But on the other hand, it's also possible that by overemphasizing the individual attainment, and the focus has been much more on skill development within media literacy. So we wanted to kind of explore this further. The second assumption is about media literacy empowering communities. So it's taken for granted sort of that, oh, your media literacy is a thing that empowers communities, but we need to interrogate them to this assumption to see if it actually holds good. Yes, there are a lot of ways in which media literacy could help with community engagement, civic participation, and so on. At the same time, we do see differences across various communities in the ways in which impact has been much lesser on, say, poorer communities, communities of color, under-resourced communities. And so we wanted to see, what are the factors, what are the different ways in which we can think about impact at the community level in terms of empowerment of communities. And a third, also interrelated, is that media literacy supports democratic practices. And it's an assumption that democracy is going to lead to equitable and inclusive presence in future. But we've also seen ways in which democracy itself is being questioned at this moment in the context of like the insurrection on Jan 6th, or in the US, on many different questions about democracy itself. So we wanted to kind of look at what is the role of media literacy in supporting democracy, or what are some assumptions about democratic practice itself, which may be limiting perhaps the way in which we look at media literacy practices. So keeping these in mind, we went on to do 3 different sections of our project, which is first the scoping review, which looked at the existing literature and especially to the lens of impact, to understand how has impact been discussed in the scope within the scope of media literacy scholarship from both media perspectives as well as literacy education perspectives. And then we did, based on this, we had, then this generated the next stage of stakeholder interviews, in-depth interviews that we did in the next stage of this project. And all of this then informed our third step, which was a survey that was conducted with multiple stakeholders to look into ideas about impact, especially because equity kept coming up in a lot of these previous stages of the research that we wanted to examine in depth. So based on this, the research questions that guide our project are: A, how is impact being defined in the media literacy research that exists? So for this, to answer this, we used the scoping review methodology, where we examined about 270 articles published in the US, focused on the US in the last 10 years, which was used as the basis to understand how impact is defined and in the literature. And based on this, we identified impact inequity as one aspect that we need to go further into. The research question: what are the main processes, what are the practices that lead to impactful media literacy? And to answer this, we went to actual media literacy practitioners to do interviews. And based on the interviews with 27 people, which we will be talking about each of these stages next, then that led us to the research question, final research question, which asked, what are the challenges, what are the possibilities, what are the opportunities that exist currently in terms of incorporating equitable, impactful media literacy practices? And for this, we did a survey with a larger group, 741 practitioners across multiple organizations, to understand these challenges and understand the opportunities. So this is like the overview of our project. And based on this, now we will be talking about the first one, which is the scoping review, which I'd like Bobby, my colleague, to please share about that step.
Yes, so as Srivi said, we started with the question of how is impact defined in media literacy research. We focused on databases that specialized in literacy and education, as well as mass communications, together 270 articles, all of which focused on the US and were published within the last 10 years. The goal of this was to kind of read through the articles and do some qualitative coding to sort of see how researchers were actually defining media literacy impact in a way that actually led to our building onto questions. So what we discovered is there are what we're calling the 6 E's of impact. We identified sort of 6 key themes within the literature, all of which are ways in which different researchers are defining the impact of their work. The first one has to do with evaluation outcomes, which is really sort of your more traditional sort of quantitative measures and experiments, and looking at the outcomes of those experiments as a way to measure or define impact. The next had to do with inquiry, and that's really your more critical media literacy space, focusing on questioning and challenging common sort of tropes and themes in media, and pushing students to really understand the relationship between power and thinking about media. Next, we identified expression, which tends to land in more of the art and creativity and media production approach to media literacy, in which impact is defined by individuals being able to take media and create some sort of form of personal expression for them. The next one has to do with experimental learning. So taking a student-led approach to both critical thinking as well as media production, and allowing the students to kind of engage in the curriculum and sort of defining impact and how much the students engaged and what the outcomes were with that kind of experimental learning. Engaged citizenship was also a core part of the research that related to measuring impact as individuals or students participating in sort of politics in some way, either through participating in a protest or simply just engaging more in political news and being able to identify different sort of aspects of politics within media and how that works. But civic engagement itself was a sort of form of impact, as a way that researchers really thought of their work as having impact, was sort of a measured move on the dial of civic engagement within the students. And finally, the last E has to do with equities. And is defined by more of an action-oriented and transformative kind of emancipatory approach to the research and to teaching, in which impact really involves looking at students taking the the sort of tools of media or using media literacy to address inequities within their communities. And it was sort of done in a lot of different ways, but the idea of impact there being that you've had an impact in your work if students are able to kind of take these tools and then address inequities in society. And all of these kind of led us to think about, you know, how the scholarship defines it is through these 6 E's, but how do practitioners who are actually on the ground and doing the work, how do they sort of think through these larger concepts and apply them in their actual, like, you know, everyday sort of lesson planning? So next, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Patrick to talk about the stakeholder interviews.
Thanks, Bobby. And before I speak on these interviews, I want to make sure to note that our colleague Emily is unfortunately in class right now. And I wanted to give her on behalf of our team a shout out for the work and the depth she put together for our scoping review. A lot of that is the result of her due diligence. So I wanted to make sure that we shouted her out for that. Now, the stakeholder interviews was a quite arduous process. So I first want to address the means of which we did this before providing you with the actual content of what came out of it. As you'll see here, this was where our second research question, which focused on practices, came to be. Well, yes, we did 27 semi-structured interviews. This process actually began with the creation of a large database of media and news literacy or news literacy, media literacy adjacent organizations around the country. And from that database, we decided to randomize using a random number generator to then identify geographically a bunch of different organizations that led us to these interviews, these 17 stakeholders. And then the 10, namely Alliance members, were also included in this interview process. Now, this diverse group is not only geographically diverse, but they also come from different organizational populations, whether it's a nonprofit or educational institutions or media companies. They themselves are diverse and their backgrounds are diverse, whether they are academics or former media professionals, which tended to be the most common places they came from. And they also are a diverse group because they service diverse audiences. And so none of these stakeholders tend to work with the same type of population. So what you will see here in our results is an opportunity to see the vastness of how media literacy is reaching different people and different groups. So if we can move to that next slide. Our 3 core findings, if you can tell, are linked very much so to our 3 assumptions. And it wasn't a difficult ask to be able to connect these ideas together. And so first and foremost, in doing these interviews and spending a lot of time with what these stakeholders and Alliance members were saying, what we learned is that a lot of the foundational practices that these stakeholders are participating in is to actually create a media literate individual. And in that process, we are creating agency. And in this agency, we're seeing this opportunity for individuals to engage in different ways that make them critical consumers or critically conscious of the world around them, particularly the media activities they are participating in. But what we also learned is that just because we're promoting individual agency, it doesn't mean that agency is enough. And so many of our practitioners also spoke about the need to build community and the need to engage with community. And so what we saw here is that equitable media literacy practice needs to be embedded in the community. And when we say embedded, what we learned is that it can't just be about a teacher, or it can't just be about a nonprofit organization. It's also about the parents. It's also about the family members. This is where we learned about generational differences that were acknowledged, or the digital divide, for example. But what we also learned is that community is a sense of empowerment. And when more than one person is working towards an outcome, a lot of our interviews revealed that ultimately, when that community works together, we actually can lead to more democratic participation, which was the final theme of these interviews. What's really important, however, about this theme is that it is the least discussed, meaning it oftentimes wasn't the most explicit of the themes that were represented in these interviews. Now, this particular concept, when different historical issues were brought up, As examples, this is when democratic participation tended to emerge. So for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the January 6th insurrection, were both talking points for many of our stakeholder interviews, as well as our alliance members. And in those moments, oftentimes our stakeholders, our interviewees, ended up sharing that they felt these were critical moments of creating equitable media literacy practices, that these are places in which we identified the need for media literacy in order to maintain, sustain, and improve democracy. Lastly, this participation piece is also focused on ethics and truth and civic responsibility, meaning that ultimately our goal here in media literacy practice and in equitable media literacy practice is to maintain high-level thinking, critical thinking, but also to simply make the world a better place. And this was only 27 voices. They were 27 very in-depth voices that lasted almost an hour for each interview, some as few as 40 minutes. But what we did is we took these findings and we took our scoping review information and we built a survey. And in this case, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the team for setting up this lovely presentation. And so now I want to talk about the survey. And as you'll see, each of these parts of the research really build upon one another. So those assumptions we laid out in the beginning that we wanted to interrogate come through this entire project, but they build. They're not they don't actually end the way they began. And as we went through the literature and we went through these interviews, we really saw that issues of equity, issues of justice are really tied up in how people think about media literacy and how people think about their practice. And as Patrick just mentioned, this is also really tied to how people think about democracy and civic engagement. But one thing that we really wanted to see is how can people do this work? How can people push for equitable practices in their daily work, and what challenges and opportunities do they have? So really, when we came to designing the survey, we focused on issues of equity and justice, and we asked respondents to answer multiple kinds of questions, and maybe some of you even took our survey. But we asked them how to describe their practice and around those three assumptions, and then their commitment to equity as well. You can go to the next slide, Paul. So we have 741 respondents. Most participants were affiliated with some form of formal education, but not all. The most common media literacy practice that people engaged in was teaching, followed by creating educational resources. This could be curricula and lesson plans and things like that. The three most commonly mentioned areas of focus were information literacy, news literacy, and digital literacy. And nearly 82% of the respondents indicated that they were members of some professional organization that supports media literacy, whether it be Namely or some others. So this is just a kind of a broad overview of the group. I'm not gonna talk about all of the survey findings, but a lot of them are in the report. And in addition, the entire questionnaire that we use is available in the report. And actually, we think one of our contributions to the literature and to the field are these questions that we ask, because we developed some really in-depth and new survey measures that combined the research on media literacy and the research on equity. But in terms of some of the most important practices, so for this, you can see here around our core assumptions, we asked people to select the most important. So when push comes to shove and we gave them the three choices, you can see individual development still ranks at the top, which is not surprising given what we found in the literature in the interviews. We also asked about equity, and these are just some of the items that we asked, but you can see that people in general, almost 60% say that issues of equity are important to them, but also a large group, almost 40%, say talking about these issues make them feel uncomfortable. So you can see this is not a clear-cut situation. But again, another large group felt that there was change. A couple other questions that I wanted to point out that are really interesting. About 49% talked about noticing biases in their learning materials. About 53% said that they proactively advocate against inequitable practices. But almost 29% said they've experienced backlash when they do this kind of work. And so throughout these findings, again, and more are in the report, you see that this is a complicated issue, right? So people want to do this kind of work. They want to support equity and equitable and just practices, but they don't always know how. And through all of the research, through the scoping review, to the interviews, to the survey, we're really seeing that this focus on the individual, which is not necessarily inherently a problem, right? We have to teach individuals and engage individuals, but the how. So this focus on individual skill sets, it can limit larger connections to community and society, but that's not inevitable. We also found that practitioners do share a commitment to equity and justice, but it's not always clear how to move forward with this work. And there is a strong feeling, and this comes out in the interviews and in conversations, that this work is politicized, and the way that we talk about equity and justice is political, and how to kind of think through those implications. And then, of course, that those larger goals, those democratic goals, are constrained, one, by this lack of support, but also this politicization and these resources that maybe are also not distributed equally. So all of these issues really come into play for our response, what we think we should actually do to push both practitioners and the field forward. And I'm going to turn it back over to Paul to lead you through this.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everybody. So I know, and to everyone with us today, we are going to transition now over to our field guide and our website, and we're going to kind of conclude by showing you what we've created, a brief preview of what we've created, and then hopefully have a little bit of a discussion here in the second portion of our webinar. So as my colleagues have said, and it's doing justice to a real large and substantial research project, right? Showing some highlights, but in our report, we've created this in an accessible way. And the report really highlights the extent to which this research, which is kind of generative and built, each part is built on the previous findings. And we hope that we're setting an agenda around the research, what research we can do and where we might look in terms of media literacy, and its focus on equity, or how it might be able to provide that for educators in informal learning environments. And so what you'll see here is our response, right? So this is kind of what to conclude the research portion and shift over to our field guide. I'll take you out of this space in a second and move us over. But impact in media literacy education should be process oriented. This is kind of something that we saw again and again. Having outcomes is good and measurable, and but the processes that go into this are almost as valuable as some of those outcomes, and we want to find a way to lift those up a little bit. As Melissa and others were talking about, we're not saying that outcomes as kind of outcomes that are measurable and individual focus is necessarily bad. That's a great place to start. But we're thinking about these in terms of equity focus. And so we kind of said, like, finding a way to move intentionally and explicitly beyond that individual level impact, right? Embrace equity and inclusion at the outset of their design, and not try to kind of back into some of those concepts. And one of our kind of really interesting findings was like looking at unsupportive environments. So, and that's not intentionally unsupportive or intentionally pushing those down. It could be unintentional as well, but just looking in that way. So these responses all led. I'm going to take everyone out of here and move you over to our website here. So what you see on the screen here is our is the final kind of product. If I can take you back to the homepage for a second, you'll see that you'll see some of our design team's work here to make this. We wanted to build an aesthetic that makes this feel welcoming and open, and you can kind of look down and see who's there and our partners, and you can read about our process more here, about our assumptions and about the research. But most importantly, obviously, you can see who's involved in our team page here, and you can meet all of us and look at our design team, and you can see who helped our work grow and flourish here. So, but there's two things that I want to highlight. The first is this is where the report is. And here you'll see, I'll just give kind of a sneak peek into what the report's like. Equity and impact in media literacy practice, mapping the field. And you can start to see in terms of this table of contents, we took you through it briefly, but we really wanted to kind of locate who we are, what we're doing, how we understand the state of media literacy and what we know about it, our assumptions, and then looking at the research. And what I'll show you today, and as everyone mentioned, we've included all the methods and approaches we've done to this research. So it's really a wonderful, wonderful document. There's a lot there. It's I think we've designed it and written it to try to be as accessible as possible. So in any case, what I'm here to do is just show you a little bit about this to end our presentation today by showing you a little bit about this output that we've created, which is what we call the Field Guide for Equitable Media Literacy Practice, right? And it's created to map equitable media literacy practices for classrooms, communities, and organizations. And I want to say 1 second as we enter into this. The guide emerges from our research into how media literacy interventions can prioritize equitable and just civic futures with intentionality, care, and purpose. And what I want to talk about a little bit is who this is kind of for. As I told you at the outset of this presentation, we kind of ground this in our values and the vision that we have. We built this in response to our research finding. We have these, who is this for? What does this offer? How do we use this and why, right? And we trying to decide this, as you can see in these questions here before we get into the guide. Our intention was to design this it's not specifically for any certain subgroup of media literacy practitioner. We talk about, if we say here, this guy's meant for people working at secondary levels of education. The ideas and the terms and the approaches here are meant to be able to be adjusted or to implemented. We aren't this not designed as a lesson plan or a suggested curriculum at this point. It's really meant as a guide. If anyone who's interested in designing media literacy interventions or practices wants to think about equity and impact in their work, here are some steps we might take to allow that to happen, right? So that's our guide here. And when we get to the end and talk about next steps, we do have a very strong interest in co-designing with different educator populations and community stakeholder populations on how you could apply some of this guide work into workshops, into lesson plans and curriculum more officially. But that wasn't the scope of this work. So as you can see here, we talk about this guide is able to be used. It's designed sequentially, but you can enter the map and enter and exit wherever you want, or you can start at the beginning and move that way. Just another note on defining terms. We're very kind of open about this, about what does equity mean to us? How do we understand social justice? What is equitable media literacy practice, inclusion? How do we understand impact? So in each one of these, we try to offer a little bit of contextualization, explain much more in our report, but also here. So process versus outcomes, and then standing on the shoulders of media literacy giants. Here we're acknowledging all the other work. We know that there is a wonderful growth, and so much that we've built on in terms of reports and curricula and guides and playbooks. And we like to say that we've used some of all of that here in our work with this guide. And then so just to show you, we talked about as a team a lot about how we could have users go through this and the kind of testing we did. And we realized that what was most valuable with this at this stage of our research and grant was to have people just be able to have simplicity and access above all else. And so each of the spaces here, where do I stand? Who cares? Imagining more inclusive futures with communities, and where do we stand? If we go into each one of these, they go from one to the other, but we wanted to make these accessible and open to all. So, you start with where do I stand, and each one of these has a similar format. We explain and contextualize what we mean by where do I stand and what standpoint means to us. We have a goal in each. And then we have 3 kind of suggestions around approaching, starting this media literacy by not looking at the piece of media or how we engage or our media use, but rather our own social location, political location, cultural location, our own backgrounds, right? Our own beliefs. And then we map those into media, right? Story of why does this matter to me and how I understand the world, right? You move to the next one, and obviously I'll go through these, not in their entirety, but we talk about after you kind of socially locate ourselves and then look at our media relationships, we try to talking about care and differentiating caring about and caring for and caring with, and bringing caring practice to the center of our media literacy interventions, right? Kind of thinking about how we signal caring about things, and then how we care for things, and being intentional about those differences, caring with others, right? And then we end with, creating a careful statements through this kind of caring ladder idea, right? And so as you go through these, you'll see, our imagination, we talk a lot about how, inspire opportunities to imagine better futures with creativity and experimenting and being open with and for our media world, right? So imagining alternatives to current situations, thinking about voice representation and connection, and then doing some world building around imagining more media inclusive futures, right? And so you can see, we can go on to these, but I'll just come back to the end of the map here. And then with communities, we start with this, our own social location, and end with this idea of where do we stand. And here we talk a lot about enabling media environments, right? And enabling environments. So we're talking about how you can move from our own social location to the collaborative capacity we have to act with and for media, with media and with communities, right? And so we talk about what enabling environments are, what types of media skills are needed to build enabling media environments for collective public action, right? The capacity to act, and then from the margins to the middle. And that's how we kind of end this space. And then when you complete the journey, we have an idea for you to reflect and then read more, and of course share with others, right? So this work is, it's free and it's open to be used. And a couple things I'll say before we kind of conclude this and then open ourselves up for some discussion is, this is not, it's a challenge for us to try to think about how this guide works and what we wanted to prioritize. It's not a complete picture or perfect, but we think it can start to shift some of those conversations towards moving beyond individual focus, thinking more about diverse communities and whose voices are included in communities and whose aren't. And then also thinking about that democracy and power and issues of kind of stakeholders and collaborative action and enabling environments. So it's born from our research. It's meant not to be didactic at this point, but just a set of potential approaches to each of these spaces. And something that we feel like, if you are a middle school teacher interested in doing kind of democracy and media lessons, or if you're a community stakeholder working with youth media groups, that you can adapt and adopt some of these approaches to your own work, right? And so I'm going to just move back here and just conclude with our next steps in our kind of final slide. So how we thought about completing this is our next step is to really do some co-design work and some testing of the field guide. Obviously, with the research report, our goal is to, we end that report with of setting agendas for research and practice, and we hope that that research report can lead to a lot of strong dialogue and critical dialogue and communication with our community of practitioners and researchers. And we hope that this guide, we'd love to start working on co-designing this with different educator groups in urban and rural areas and different political and demographic profiles, and actually thinking about how we can build stronger content that can apply to classrooms and communities alike. And we obviously want to expand this focus beyond just the United States and look beyond borders and beyond cultures and see how we could do this globally as well. So I think, we're pretty good on our timing. And I lastly want to thank this community for being with us, and again, thank our colleagues and Michelle and Sherry and all others involved. We've given a lot here in this webinar. We're happy to take questions as a group, and but I think what's most important is that this report is out and this guide is out, and we are really looking forward to engaging and talking more about this, and hopefully seeing what can be built around this, and what part of this are contested, and what parts of this are appreciated, and what questions emerge out of this. So again, thanks to everybody for being with us today, and looking forward to the discussion. And yeah, Michelle, thanks.
Thanks, Paul. So can all the research team join us? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was like so comprehensive, and I'm so excited to hear it all. It's so awesome. Okay, so, but it's not about me. Let's just talk about questions. So we have a few really awesome questions from people that are in attendance. So I'll just start. So the design elements are such an interesting aspect of this work. Can you talk a little bit more about why you felt it was important? It definitely feels and looks different than research many people have seen. So could we talk a little bit about why that was such an important aspect?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I can start that one out a little bit. I think, you know, you know, I'd like to say that we, you know, the drier academic stuff is coming. So don't be there. You know, we're planning on, you know,
we won't disappoint.
Yeah, don't worry about that. It's coming. You know, I do think there's some, I do think, you know, we, as applied scholars, you know, I obviously as someone who runs a graduate program in media design and thinks a lot about how design can help different stakeholders map onto this work. I think it was really important for us to create something that's useful across groups. And a huge part of that is the aesthetic with which people feel like they can map onto something. You know, I think we had a super extensive review of field guides and different playbooks and different kind of curriculum tools. And I think, you know, we wanted something that was not so text heavy, that fit into a nice aesthetic. And so in all of our conversations from the beginning, we had designers with us, and they were probably bored as can be, you know, hearing us talk about that. But like when it came time to it, it was really inclusive. They understood what we were hoping for. They're really amazing. And they were helping us shape the research in ways by thinking about how this will be usable in and for communities. And so I think it's really important as like a media literacy principle, right? It's really about how we can onboard and provide things for communities that help them in very open and accessible ways.
Yeah, it feels just like in the best possible way, very deliberate, you know, like very thoughtful, very deliberate. And, you know, just another shout out to Sumi Day, who's Namely's office coordinator now, but has been designing on this project. So yeah, it's such an interesting element. Did you, Srivi, Melissa, anyone want to add to that, or I can go on to the next question? You're good.
I think that one of the things about impact, since we're studying impact, we wanted it to, and equity. One of the aspects of this was the values of accessibility and, you know, making some, to a public, making something like a public facing document was aligned with the values that we had discussed as a team, and also with the content of what we are creating. So in that sense, it was important also, for instance, for the team, the graduate students on this team, we you know, really the ones who are designers, but also the researchers have really been so crucial to this team. So in many ways, we were trying to kind of model that in all aspects of what we were doing. So thank you for the question.
Great. So for those that are new to media literacy, that are unfamiliar with media literacy, could you describe kind of the new knowledge that we gained with this that helps us kind of like convey the importance of media literacy and gain, you know, more advocates, more people that are doing media literacy? Like, what new knowledge have we gained?
I can start if you want, and then anyone else can jump in. I think oddly enough, this question actually follows kind of from what we just discussed, because the idea of accessibility and being inclusive also drove how we approach the research. So from the jump, when you heard about the scoping review, we took a very broad approach to what media literacy is or was, or in the research, to try to capture a range of scholarship. So we were very purposeful in that approach. And that sort of then drove everything else. When Patrick talked about the kinds of people we interviewed, we didn't just go with someone that would, you know, name themselves a media literacy practitioner, right? We looked broadly. And then when we got to the survey, we actually, as I mentioned, that all the questions are available. We used some existing scales to measure media literacy, but we actually drew heavily on equity literacy and equity research. And so I think our attempt to pull from these related but disparate fields, who, you know, play in different sandboxes, but really should be at one big sandbox together. I think that's actually a major contribution. And so bringing together these this work and saying these assumptions that drive media literacy, well, those are also assumptions that drive people who care about justice. And how can we bring these things together? So I think our approach in bringing these fields together in conversation and building from there is a major contribution of this work. And we hope that through the way that we not only presented the research, but the field guide with that outward looking perspective, that people will feel that they can come to this and that they can be, seen here. And another thing I think that we've done, and I hope that others see this and value it, is what Paul talked about at the beginning, our transparency. I think the way we talk about the work and the way we talk about ourselves as part of the project is something that is also a contribution of this work, because that's not always done, particularly in research. And so to me, those were kind of built in from the beginning and have been part of our process. And we've really valued process throughout as well. So I think those are some of our big contributions.
Well said. Anybody want to add to that? So I'm gonna just interrupt me if you have anything to say. Let's just make that an agreement. Someone pointed out that this entire perspective seems very progressive. So there's an assumption here that social justice issues deserve exploring time and attention. But we know right now that there's some controversy about that. And if we, think about the conversations right now having on a societal basis around critical race theory, how do we reconcile those challenges? And do you anticipate that coming up as this research kind of goes out into the world?
Maybe I can take this since I just moved from Texas. Yeah, we cannot talk about critical race theory, but I'm here in New York and I can talk about it. We discussed at length about this, and in some ways, the choice of the word equity over social justice also was meant to keep the given the political context that we are in the US right now, we also used equity, which had a sense of being more inclusive as a term. But overall, we should say that we were pleased that a lot of people who took our surveys there was a range of political ideologies represented, and Melissa can talk more about it. And we recognize that different people are going to come to this topic from different points of view or perspective, standpoints. And that's exactly why the field guide, one of the first things when you enter the field guide is to ask about your standpoint. Mm-hmm. And reflecting on your values and your resources or your background. So we made it broad so that depending on your context or your particular community that you are focused in, your own identity, all of these, you can still learn something hopefully from this, we have no idea how people might use this or how it might be applied, but we do hope that we can have these productive conversations exactly about the kinds of things that you're bringing up in terms of critical race theory and so on, also with this tool. And that's the purpose of putting that up front and centering this in our research, because we could have researched impact from any of the other E's, but we then decided to focus more on the equity part, because that's the understudied topic, but it seemed most important precisely because of what you are sharing, and it seems very timely, therefore.
Yeah, and just to jump in, and I think Paul started the slide deck with our values. We don't
Mhm.
hide from our values in this research, and I think that's part of that transparency that I'm talking about. So we're not saying this is only for certain kinds of people with certain kinds of political views, but we are saying this is driven by our vision of what democracy could be, right? Our vision of what this work could be and could do. And part of what we explore in the research, and why we call why we called them assumptions, particularly, is because they underlie a lot of things, but they're not always made explicit. And sometimes it is because I think there is a fear of articulating a standpoint, about where research can be valuable, where these products can be valuable. So I think for us that's foundational, and all of us do work and research in these areas, as part of, I can say pretty openly, I value democracy, right? I'm not afraid to say that I value democracy, but what do I mean by democracy? And that's something that we pushed on in this, right? Democracy for whom? Democracy by whom? Democracy with whom, right? So those are the kinds of things that where we feel like our values are there, but the research is still rigorous. The outcomes are still rigorous. So if anyone wants to challenge us on the empirics, they can, but we have the evidence, to back it up. But as Srivi's talking about, we made deliberate decisions in how we approach these questions. And we put everything out there in the report so that scholars can have these conversations and practitioners. And, we asked about being uncomfortable in the survey.
Mhm.
Part of this work is being uncomfortable sometimes. And that's okay for us to be uncomfortable too, especially if and when those challenges come.
Paul, did you want to
Yeah,
add something?
just
Go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry,
I was going
Bobby,
to say
go
to
ahead.
quickly tease out the next steps possibly for this project. That's one of the conversations we would like to have with communities and with practitioners, because something that was really clear in the interviews is that folks were saying just that they don't know how to talk about these issues, or they're worried about things being politicized. And depending on location, or potentially, you work for an organization that's national, so you want to reach the most people, or maybe you're focused on one particular community. So that's where hopefully in the next steps of this, or the next phases of this, we can tackle those things more specifically and see what are the kind of differences based on community and region, and how we can talk a little bit more about where that politicization happens, and maybe address it potentially in curriculum.
Yeah, and there was another related question about reaching those communities that are weary of these terms. And I think that's the challenge, and that's what we have to do, right, moving forward. Paul, did you want to share?
No, I mean, I think I can just share a little bit on what you just said about the next question. I think everyone's answered it wonderfully. And I think the one thing about how do you reach those communities, I mean, I think we tried to be as intentional as we could in the field guide about not having language in there that was overly kind of it's obviously it comes from a perspective, but we tried to have language that could be applied in different ways, right? And we really we spent a lot of time writing and rewriting, sharing that and testing it with educators to try to get the language right, so that it might come from this perspective, but it does have intention to be open, and that's we hope that we can offer that. And so
it's great. So lots of great questions. Thank you to our attendees. So here's a question about survey participants. So when it comes to survey participants' attitudes towards equity goals, did you find any variation according to subfields like newslit or info lit?
I can take a quick one at that, and then Patrick can jump in if he wants. We haven't done that yet.
Okay.
So
that's the next step.
So no. We broke it up in the report, and Patrick can talk about some of the comparisons we found, but we haven't broken it up in that way. So we've actually broke it up in a couple different ways. But for the more academic side, the next set of papers, we will be doing different things like that. But we did let people choose more than one field, so it might get complicated with how we break people up. But I'd love Patrick to talk a little bit about the comparisons that we did, and kind of some of those differences we saw among the groups that we do, the way we did break it up for this round.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating
Someone's getting yelled at later.
Right. So one of the most fascinating things, at least for me as a former high school educator who's now returned back to academia and seeing from this world from a totally different perspective, is that when we looked at the survey, we were able to break down into categories of those who work in higher ed, those who work in K-12 environments, those who work in library environments, those who work in administrative environments, which included K-12 and higher ed, as well as some of our nonprofits. And so in looking at these groups in those particular sections, what we actually learned is quite often teachers tend to be like way more excited about doing equity-based work, but oftentimes feel very afraid to do the equity-based work. The administrators, to be a teaser, all of you should read the report, because the administrators are one of the most fascinating groups in the whole piece, because ultimately they are consistently in opposition in their response to their teachers, both at the higher ed level and the K-12 level, which is someone who was in a former K-12 school, that is not a surprise to me, that there is oppositional thinking there. And then our media professionals and our nonprofits tended to be like super neutral in all cases. They valued it, but like it wasn't like it was difficult for them. They weren't facing maybe some of that pushback, which is something that was very clear also in our interviews, is that people who were practitioners in maybe nonprofit sectors or media sectors knew that this needed to be done. They knew that the attitudes needed to change. They know that there's a problem, there's a concern, that we aren't favoring equitable practices nationwide. But it tended to be the Alliance members in particular, who tend to work with teachers, that were recognizing that there were barriers that were causing some of these issues regarding attitudes. And the survey teased that out a little bit more. And so that's one of the things that we've highlighted in the report, is these different groups and how they each individually responded more collectively.
That oppositional voice between kind of administrator and practitioner is really interesting. And I think that that has come up in other surveys and other kind of mapping with media literacy. And it seems like something that really needs to be explored in order for us to like successfully scale the work, So very interesting. So we have a question from a Newhouse alum. Yay, Newhouse. So what suggestions do panelists have to bridging our academic backgrounds with community application? And I think this is a great question for these particular researchers. So around projects, collaborations, initiatives to pursue. Any suggestions?
So maybe I could say that one of the things that what I loved about this group actually is that so many in our team are community engaged academics and scholars, right? So and that was, I think, maybe an intentional decision in bringing us together, but so we are sort of atypical compared to the regular, like, typical academics. So, but I would say that as Melissa mentioned, that the rigor of academic scholarship that still has to be maintained. At the same time, we have to be able to, especially as media scholars, I think, be able to make that science or that research, or not to say that all research is only scientific, but systematic. So any systematic analysis which is thorough and which is engaged in conversation with existing scholarship needs to be made available and be to everybody. And and then this whole, of course, this whole thing about scholars versus community. There is a power difference here, and we are trying, and there are cultural differences, right, in what is valued. So we have to sort of also be conscious and reflexive of that in terms of how we position. So I think active listening from both perspectives, from all groups, is really important, because I think researchers and academics have something valuable to share, depending on what the context is, and they need to do better in terms of listening and incorporating community work. So a lot of it is community based or community oriented, but we want to get to a space where it is co-created and the community becomes like a co-partner in the work. So I think that's the next stage of our project, where we want to take these outcomes and have conversations about, what does this make sense? Do we need to tweak things? How do we go from here? And that is, and then just the design, the community, keeping the community in mind in writing for the public, or making things accessible, and we hope that that's reflected in the field guide, for instance. And then being able to take this to different groups where they already meet, where they already can have conversations, and to be able to offer it, and then see what which groups for whom it makes sense. So I think it's kind of like the process in which we approach the values, the cultural humility with which we might approach this. All of it is very crucial. So thank you for bringing up this question. I think especially Newhouse, Alan would do that, because they see both sides of industry, community, as well as the third side of academia. So, anybody here could answer that, because so all of us here value that collaboration.
I actually saw, Patrick, you had unmuted. Also, did you want to add anything to what Srivi just mentioned?
Yeah, I think ultimately intentionality is probably one of the most important pieces. I think, as Melissa said, we were transparent in what we thought. As Paul started the conversation, we were transparent in what we believed. And quite often, I think what makes research that is put into action and with communities important, and what I think we are offering here that's important, is that we were very intentional in not just the design and the process, but in the care we took with the stakeholders, with the materials, like the use of the field guide, in the sense that it was created. Bobby and Paul and I spent many days over like just little itty bitty words in order to be sure that we were intentional, that the people that we were serving were being served in a capacity that made their lives hopefully better. And I think by positioning that sense of care, that intentionality of care, that ethic of care, I think what we as a team really tried to do was show that media literacy arguably is the place that has the capacity to help us care more and care about and care with people more. And so I think if we were to really do more work like this, I think there is a need to be intentional in the purposes of which we do it, in the communities of which we're serving.
I love that. Well,
yeah,
it's
more just
okay.
I just quickly jump in with some like practical advice. Part of what kind of forced us, and I think would be helpful for academics, is just giving yourself less words to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was that?
Less words to say something. Yes.
Okay, let's just shout out to everyone out there.
Yeah, it forces you to really decide what's really important and how can I say it in a few bullet points, or a few, with the field guide especially. It forced us to decide, we wanted it to be more visual. So it forced a design thinking aspect of how do we visually represent what we're trying to say, as well as with less words, how do you kind of, write to an audience that's going to essentially the same lessons that I'm always teaching my journalism students. We have a skimming audience. So how do you write to kind of visually catch the eye, but also make it skimmable? And maybe it'll catch attention and people will live with it a little bit more. So just some practical advice would be thinking visually through things, but also thinking of how to say things in less words, you know, rather than structuring everything you write as an academic paper. Sit down and maybe think through or outline how you would write it, you know, as an article for, you know, a newspaper or anything else. You know, how would you try and communicate? And we do it anyway as educators, right? We think about how to write lecture notes and build slides that are maybe not as text heavy. So it's just taking that and applying it to other aspects of your work.
So that's so interesting. I could talk to you guys forever. I let's end with a question that I would love potentially for everyone to just kind of round robin and answer. And it came, the question is, what do we still need to learn, and what should we research next? So I'm gonna go around. So Bobby, I'm gonna call on you. What's next? What do we need to do next as a media literacy community?
I think we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, which is actually, you know, as was brought up, how difficult these conversations are and how politicized things would become. The next steps are really kind of getting into that and figuring out where the issues are, and how to better communicate maybe, and bridge those gaps between those divides. You know, in the report, we kind of talk about up top about addressing polarization in society and how this work can really kind of help with that. So I think that those are the next steps, at least as I see them.
Patrick, how about you? What do you think we still need to learn, and what would be the next research project to explore?
I think we have to understand the kids, and where they're coming from and where they're going. I have a particular dedication to student journalists in particular, and what they're capable of doing, and why media literacy is so core to what they do, but sometimes they don't realize that they do it. And so I think it's the kids, and I think the end goal would be the professionals and trying to figure out how to fix them, because they have screwed some stuff up over the years, and that is for sure.
Oh, sure. Just drop that at the end of this conversation, Patrick. Thank you. Srivi.
My work is focused a lot on anti-racism and racial justice over many years. So for me, it's exciting to see, for us to be in this moment. And I think that for me, I would like to see the media literacy field itself, in terms of practitioners and educators and researchers itself, become more inclusive in terms of racial and ethnic minorities, and also to kind of go beyond the scope of US to consider all of these questions in multiple contexts beyond the US. So for me, that would be very exciting. I think that's something to consider in the future.
Great. Melissa?
I mean, what do we still need to learn? So much, right? Like
Yes, so much.
all this is the thing about research, right? All good research leads to more research questions, and to me, like, this is the most exciting part about exploring these next steps, is really taking all of this work that we've done and then putting it out in the public and getting into communities and saying, okay, now what? Where are we wrong? Where do we need to, you know, push ourselves and push our thinking further? So I think, you know, some of that for the specific project, but also in terms of like some of the things that this has brought up that I think Srivi just kind of mentioned too, like bringing these ideas of equity and justice, and particularly this notion of care that's come up a few times as part of media literacy, and making that central and not peripheral, and really putting that in the core of this work and seeing it as potentially transformative in the ways that Patrick was talking about. So I hope that we're able to be part of that conversation, along with the tons of practitioners and academics and community members who are already doing that work and really pushing this research agenda forward.
Awesome. Final word, Paul. No pressure.
I have nothing to add.
You have to add something. We can't just end that way.
You know,
say something important.
I think what I'm going to say this is called thoughts I have had in no particular order.
Yes.
No, I think from this experience and what we want to do next is, I think the media literacy space it's been growing so much in such vibrant ways, and I still think I'm quite wedded from this research around what are the conditions necessary to continue to build agency in our young people, and that's really what the question is: agency towards equitable outcomes, towards racial equity and anti-racism, towards communities of need and building vibrant communities of practice. To me, that's what our research has shown, and I think what everyone's speaking a little bit about is how can we build and activate that, and media is part of that, but a big part of that is just kind of what are the conditions that are needed to enable our the next generations to do this work, and we hope we can add a little bit through this report, but I think Michelle and I think our group is hoping that this work can start an agenda towards that end, and that's what we can provide here for the community. So
awesome. Well, thank you all so very much for all of this work. I'm very excited to do whatever we can to make sure it gets distributed and shared and check off all those next steps with you. So we will keep everyone informed on how that progresses. But thank you so much. Everyone that is here, thank you for attending. US Media Literacy Week continues. It's not over yet. We have another event starting at 6:30 and that about our cyber citizenship portal. And then tomorrow we have a wonderful event with Reuters at 11 a.m. and then a really interesting event with Women Make Movies at 4. So please check it out. Continue to follow us at #MediaLitWK. Thank you. This was great. I hope you guys sleep well tonight.
thank you.
Thank you for everything.
Everybody.
Thank
Okay,
you.
see you soon. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Everybody. See ya.